So welcome to the final city forum of the semester. I've learned to probably not schedule a city forum right before fall break, so it's a lesson learned. I'll make a note for myself. But I'm Alex Carner, faculty coordinator for City Forum. And today we've got Dr. Lauren Ames Fischer giving a talk on micromobility and mobility justice in North Texas. Dr. Fischer is an assistant professor at the University of North Texas in the Department of Public Administration. She serves as Associate Director of the Advanced Environmental Research Institute, which is one of the university's 4 interdisciplinary centers of research excellence. Her research investigates how local land use and transportation policies affect environmental sustainability, racial segregation, and spatial equity in American cities. And using mixed methods and community-based research, her work aims to inform public decision-making and local government responses to changing environmental and social conditions. Dr. Fischer's work has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and the Environmental Defense Fund. She's consulted on urban transport projects in Boston, New York, Chicago, and Atlanta, and completed international research on transit financing in Australia and China for the Volvo Research and Educational Foundation. Dr. Fischer received her PhD in urban planning from Columbia University, where she also completed a National Science Foundation Fellowship in the Fu Foundation School of Engineering. So let's welcome Dr. Fischer to City Forum.
Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Happy Friday and happy almost Thanksgiving. It's lovely to see you guys here today. Thanks so much to Alex and the program for inviting me to talk today. I've already got an introduction, so you know a little bit about me. I also want to point out 2 of my collaborators on the project who are visiting us today, Rosalie Ray and Keenan Lindsay, who, as you can see up here, are at Texas State University. So this is a project that is very much still in process. I'm looking forward to presenting some of our preliminary but really sort of working findings on the topic of on-demand micromobility and mobility justice in North Texas. So just a little bit about me to kind of ground what you're going to hear today in terms of my research. As Alex said, I'm interested in how local governments and regional governments in particular are implementing these very sort of broad and abstract ideas related to equity and justice. A lot of my work has looked at not large cities, but at smaller or mid-sized cities, particularly in the Midwest. So I'm really interested in sort of how these non-global cities, if we use those terms, are dealing with the challenges, right? These are cities that have less capacity, that don't always have the same growth trajectory. And so the questions that really motivate a lot of my research is not sort of this who governs, which is a traditional question out of political science, but it's about how do the people who govern. What are the tactics and strategies and tools that they use to pursue these abstract ideas around equity, justice, sustainability? And I'm really interested in how that interacts with sort of power structures and thinking about power and disparate impacts. And so I think about research in terms of, and policy research in terms of who wins, who loses, by what mechanisms of power, and are sort of developing solutions desirable, and in what ways are they desirable, right? One of the things that I also think a lot about, and my research is moving more into, is trying to think theoretically about implementation and planning. So one of my favorite books is Pressman and Wildavsky's Implementation. It came out in 1973, but I think it's still relevant. We talk a lot about policy solutions. We evaluate how policies work or don't. But the actual process of implementation and the trade-offs that people make in decision-making, I'm interested in illuminating those more, right? And when I think about policy implementation, I really do think about it as a struggle over the realization of ideas. Okay. So an outline for today's talk, I'm going to start with sort of an overview, thinking about equity and justice, and what are those, and what are some of the literature around that in urban transportation in particular. I'll talk a little bit about our research questions and methodology, and then I'm going to focus the bulk of the talk today on a case study that we're developing of the Denton County Transit Authority, which is located in the DFW area, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that background. The interesting part about this case, as you'll hear us talk about, is that DCTA is one of the first examples in the nation of an agency trying to replace its entire fixed route bus route with an on-demand system. And so we're trying to understand sort of what are the implications of that, how do you navigate that, and what is the rocky road of implementation in trying to sort of supplant traditional technology with brand new technology. So since most of you are in a planning school, well, raise of hands, who has heard of the term equity before, right? So everyone knows that this is a major sort of policy framework that's in front of us. We talk about it a lot. It's a big word, right? There's a lot to unpack under it. So I'm going to walk through a couple slides, sort of giving you some insight into how I'm thinking about it and how we're thinking about it with this project. Right? Clearly, equity has outcomes, right? Are the distributions of burdens and benefits across society fair is sort of a broad question for that. But equity also has aspects related to process and structures, right? How do current systems put burdens or excessive benefits with certain groups and not with others, right? And then really when I'm thinking about process and structure, I'm also thinking about how can we correct sort of the imbalances that we've built historically over time with new tools, new methods, new decision-making processes. When we think about equity in urban transit, we have some specific federal guidelines, right? So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 laid out not necessarily equity, but a framework of discrimination and disparate impacts. You can see here that that's influencing how the Federal Transit Authority asks local transit providers to evaluate and think about their work. Right? So Federal Transit Authority says they don't want disparate impact, treatment, or disproportionate burden in terms of service changes. It requires agencies that have 50 or more fixed route vehicles and that serve populations larger than 200,000 to go through sort of an equity evaluation process whenever they're thinking about making major changes to the system, adding routes, cutting routes, changing things. But notice that this is for fairly large systems, right? So there's been some excellent critique, particularly by Dr. Karner, around sort of this question of how much do the FTA guidelines and how much does equity, as we currently practice it, actually get us the outcomes that we would like. This is a report that came out last year from Transit Center talking about equity in practice. And it went through and thought about sort of our last 50 years experience with Title VI mandates, right? And here's some of the findings that they highlight, right? That Title VI is very a weak regulatory power. There's significant discretion that local agencies have to define what counts as disparate impact, to define what counts as a major change. And so you're really still leaving a lot of the decision-making power with the agency, right? Which can have some benefits if the agency is engaged with the community and in this deliberative discussion. But in practice, right, we don't necessarily see that play out. The Title VI, as it's kind of currently implemented, also lacks a regional or network perspective. Proximity analysis, which is looking at who lives near transit, is very different than looking at who actually uses transit, right? But from a methodological perspective, it's a lot easier to do a proximity analysis than it is to collect data on specific users and riders, right? And I'll say here that we're finding this particularly true when we think about micromobility and microtransit. Right? If you want to do rider surveys for a fixed route system, you can go to the bus stop, you can talk to people at the bus stop, you can go on the bus, right? But when we're doing on-demand mobility, there's a different service structure that makes it more difficult to sort of collect this data about users potentially. It's also, as we know, looking at experience, easily gamed for desired outcomes. Right? In this report too, there was an important element highlighted about sort of who's making decisions about the systems that we have versus who's using the systems that we have. Right? So Transit Center has done some great work on agency representation. And they found that 60% of US transit users identify as people of color, but while 66% of transit agency staff and leadership do not, right? So we have a little bit of a disconnect. I think it's also true that a lot of people who sit on transit agency boards, particularly in smaller systems, don't have personal experience with transit, right? And that's one of the issues that we see in DCTA, where we have a board that's making decisions, but none of them actually ride transit on a regular basis, or have ever really been on transit as sort of a daily use, right? So we have sort of this disconnect between who's deciding and who's supposed to be benefiting from the system. There's some good suggestions that have come out of this sort of critical analysis. So as you can see here, more organizational support for internal equity, changes to financing and organizational decision-making structures, adopting agency-wide equity strategies that aren't just about service models, but that go all the way through procurement and staffing and decision-making. And there's also been a lot of focus on sort of new data and methods for equity analysis. Right? As you can see from this example, there's a lot of transit agencies that are coming up with new ways to think about how do we measure equity. Right? So here's an example from Portland, where you can see that minority and low-income access should be 5% or better than non-minority and non-low-income access across all of these sort of traditional metrics that we use to evaluate the quality of transportation services. Right? Another example here, this is from, I think, San Diego. Right? So looking at sort of access to work by different population groups that we know have different histories of marginalization. Right? And a lot of the best practices around this are that it should be a proactive exercise. right? This should be something that you're doing before you're making policy decisions to understand sort of where do we want to add routes, where do we want to change systems, so that we can benefit groups that have not historically benefited. But here I want to put forward sort of a broader question, right? We talk a lot about equity, but is equity the goal, right? What do we mean when we're thinking about equity? And here, when we go to the planning literature or even sort of the philosophical literature, it's helpful to sort of unpack this term a little bit more. Right, so we all know these series of equity things that have come out, right? Ballparks and fences and bicycles and trees. This is a new one, right? Or newer one that just came out last year. And what I like about this is sort of thinking about how equity, right, can help at sort of an individual level. It's a deficit model. But as you can see here, justice is really about shifting the whole system so that we don't need to put in those sort of deficit models or those individual aspects to help people, but the system, in theory, serves everyone equally or serves people as they need to be served. So this is from a paper that Dr. Karner put out not too long ago, right? But also thinking about sort of this difference between equity and justice, right? And who's using these different terminologies, and are they compatible? Are we talking about the same things when we're having these conversations about what's fair, right? When we think about equity, we're thinking about reforming processes. We're thinking about fine-tuning the distribution of goods and services, maybe providing more bus service or higher frequency train service to particular communities. But when we're thinking about justice, we're really thinking about transforming the entire sort of social structure of which transportation or transportation systems are a part of. Right? I think an important part here that's been laid out in some of the research is the difference between who uses these terms as well. Right? So we see state actors, agency officials talking about equity. Right? That's understandable since the FTA also gives them that term and that guidance on equity. When we think about justice, we're really seeing activists, people who are outside the system that are agitating or pushing for much more broader changes in terms of how we even think about the relationship between transportation and access to opportunities or goods or success in life. So thinking about sort of this equity and justice is how we're framing the project that I'm going to present to you a little bit more today, right? The first question is, do local stakeholders even pursue equity and justice? Do they have a commitment to it? Right? Sometimes we assume that because the FTA says they should or because they put the words into some of their plans that there's a commitment. But I think it's worth kind of critically reflecting on what is the purpose of transit agencies in their own eyes, and is equity and justice sort of part of the framework that they lay out themselves? Right? And in particular, I'm interested in thinking about this in mid-sized cities and public organizations, right? So the MTA in New York or Los Angeles Transit Authority is very big, right? They don't have enough capacity, but they have significant capacity to maybe think about these things, to move in this space a little bit more. But when we're thinking about the transit agencies that are at the edge of areas that are growing or that are trying to sort of get off the ground and do new things, there might be sort of different frameworks at work here. So we have a couple of other questions, right? This, how do local stakeholders pursue equity and justice? But I'm also interested in this question of, are equity and justice sort of on a time frame together? Can we move from equity or to pursue equity as steps toward justice? Or are these really two different things, right? There's some good sort of arguments in the philosophical literature that the more that we just tweak at existing systems, the more we're allowing power imbalances to stay how they are. Right? Even if we're providing goods and enhancements to individuals, are we really having that change at sort of the structural organizational level that we need? And another question that we have is, what are these causal pathways for justice? If we're going to sort of reorient the tree in this example, what are the things that sustainably reorient that tree? So what are the actual implementation tools that help move us more toward these justice outcomes? In terms of transportation, there's been some good literature in sort of talking about this. So Karl Martin's book, Transportation Justice, or Transport Justice, that came out in 2016, talks about how we can do different types of analyses, sort of like we saw in that, right, in the Portland example, or in this example as well, right? We can think about sort of new modes, socioeconomic status, and doing accessibility by group, thinking about different metrics, including setting sort of minimum accessibility levels that we want to see across systems. But the key here is that this is largely about change within systems, right? Sort of tweaking how we're doing things within current agencies. from a different perspective, Mimi Scheller has laid out this idea of mobility justice, right? Which is not just about new data or new methods for exploring equity, but is really about thinking about system-wide change and some of the assumptions and critical thought that needs to go into rethinking how we package the entire offering of transportation as part of the goods society provides. And in here, we're really thinking about changes to the system and looking very deeply at power imbalances that might be ingrained in those systems and how they could hinder us from pursuing certain outcomes or getting to certain locations. So mobility justice is the framework that we're using to understand sort of equity and justice and micromobility in this case. Right? As you can see here, Scheller lays out a handful of sort of different ways that we should be thinking about justice. Right? There's distributive justice, which is very closely related to equity, right? Ensuring that resources are distributed equally across the population. Right? But then she lays out a couple more things that are more related to questions of governance and questions of process. Right? And so there's deliberative justice, which recognizes specific groups' vulnerabilities. There's procedural justice, inclusion of those groups and empowerment in decision-making. Restorative justice, thinking about the historical timelines of how transportation and land use in our cities in general have marginalized some people and supported others. And then also this idea of epistemic justice. Right? Our decision makers and those of us who are working in sort of transportation policy, are we open to new knowledge? Are we open to being critical of our current practices? Are we open to really sort of shaking things up, maybe even some of our basic assumptions about the world, in a way that can not just empower marginalized groups, but really get them in seats of decision making that can start to shift that tree, right, more towards sort of a justice metric. Right. And so all of these together, the idea is, can lead to changes in system and power imbalances in a way that gives us sort of bigger system-wide justice changes. So today we're going to think about sort of that was our framework, sort of thinking about equity and justice and how we think about it or how I'm thinking about it and some of the recent literature on it. We're really interested in applying this framework to these new technologies and sort of new service models that have come out over the last decade, right? So lots of you are aware of sort of micromobility or microtransit, right? Here you can see some of the typical suspects here, right? Bike share, scooters. This is the GO zone that we're going to be talking about today. This is on-demand microtransit. Right? There's a lot of potential claims about benefits for microtransit and how it can help existing or traditional sort of structures of transportation service. Right? It's flexible and on-demand. It can respond to individual rider needs in different ways. Right? In particular, solving the first or last mile problem that transit is often plagued with. Right? It's also highly variable, right? Which means that you can pick sort of different modes, different service models, different scope of geographic scales to fit different conditions, or so the claims go. Right? And the potential benefits include expanding coverage area at a more sort of cost-effective. Right? So these are a lot of the claims that are out there in the literature. Micromobility has really only been something that's been around for the last decade, and so understanding kind of how it's evolving is a big part of focus. Right? In particular, I just saw yesterday that I think bird scooters have filed that they're no longer financially sustainable and might be going away. Right? I do think one of the challenges, and we'll talk about it a little bit today with micromobility, is how reliable are these long term? Right? When we're thinking about sort of building out our infrastructure systems for transportation, can we guarantee that these services, often provided by private companies with significant venture capital backing, will still be around to continue to provide that level of mobility that we want to see? And when we look at the last 10 years of history, we see that there's a lot of sort of flipping back and forth, right? Companies that come into cities and then are gone within a couple of years, change their names, change their models. So from a user perspective, that can be really challenging, right? From a planning perspective, it's very, very challenging because we don't know sort of what technologies and models we can rely on going forward. All said, micromobility gets a lot of attention in sort of the policy world and in transportation and in planning. And we're doing a lot of equity analysis around micromobility, right? So these maps should look familiar to you guys, right? This is Austin. This is a paper that came out last year, right? Looking at equity and micromobility. Right? And here you can see a very sort of traditional approach to how do we gauge the equity impacts of micromobility. Right? We do a proximity analysis. We look at sort of where the service is being offered. We compare that to demographic data on low income or groups of minority groups, right? Or historically marginalized groups too. There's a lot of discretion in how we do that. Right? And you can see here, right, that when we look at the demographic distribution versus where we look at accessibility is of scooters, dock bikes, and dockless bikes, right, we do see some correlations that suggest that maybe they're not as equitable. Right? This is really thinking about that first leg of Scheller's claims about distributive justice, right? We're evaluating sort of the equity service and who's getting service and who's not getting service from micromobility, right? And not all that surprising, right? You can see here that there is a negative relationship between where micromobility is and Black populations, right? You can see that there's a negative correlation with transit populations, but we can also see that those relationships sort of change depending on what type of micromobility we're looking at, don't always hold consistently over time, right? It's sort of a shifting landscape a little bit. Right? And we also know that just proximity analysis isn't necessarily a strong predictor of sort of where services are being provided. Right? So demographics is helpful for thinking about, but it's not the whole story in terms of what's going on. So with this distributive justice up here, we have some methods for sort of thinking about, right, who's getting service and who's not getting service for micromobility. But as we start to move down the scale here, right, we're really starting to think about process decisions and sort of trade-offs that are being made in decision-making and the deep story of how we're governing, right? And so what we're going to do today is talk through sort of these governance questions a little bit more using a case of micromobility in North Texas. So some of the questions that motivated this project were how are local actors sort of evaluating and thinking about micromobility impacts? Are they thinking about equity in micromobility, or do they really have sort of a technological framework on that's not thinking about sort of the human or the user component? Right? We're also really interested in this question, right? How are we comparing benefits of fixed route systems to on-demand systems? These are very different service models. We can do proximity analysis for both of them, but how does a single agency develop a method or a metric for gauging the effectiveness of a fixed route bus versus an on-demand model? And we're going to walk you through what one agency is doing today as a way to sort of illuminate some of these developing practices. Right? The bigger questions that we're sort of weighing in here around theory and sort of theory, policy implementation are, as I mentioned earlier, this question of can incremental changes, sort of tweaking within the system, be a pathway to transforming the system overall? Or are those really sort of two different pathways of implementation? How do they work with each other? What kinds of question and learning can happen under incremental systems that may lead to system-wide changes? And we're also interested in thinking about what are those causal pathways to change. And anytime we're thinking about what works, we're also asking ourselves, what are the barriers to those things working? Right? What are some assumptions we have about how the world works? What are financing or organizational structures that might be preventing us from seeing sort of critical thought or critical opportunities within transforming the transportation system? So again, thinking about these bigger questions of sort of how do those who govern govern? How do they identify solutions to fix their problems? How do they define even their problem scope? And then how do we decide when there's multiple potential solutions to problems, which ones to move forward with? Right? So thinking about this in terms of micromobility. So to understand this in depth, we've been doing, for the past year, a deep case dive into this example in Denton, Texas. Right? Here you can see Denton. It's at the very northern end of the DFW area. Right? Denton is technically in the suburban sort of DFW area today, but Denton was founded about 150 years ago with 2 colleges pre-1900, and so has a very clear sort of identity to its own. Right? Here you can see the new micromobility service that has been piloted now for 14 months in Denton. And so this is really a project that is in process. This is something that's going on, that's changing pretty constantly, and we're trying to study it as the ship is moving. Right? So you guys will sort of give me some patience as we walk through this example today. Because I think one of the exciting things about doing research as it's in motion is that you can deeply engage with decision making. You get really good understandings about the trade-offs that are being made in the moment. When you ask people a couple years later what worked and what didn't, there's a different story than when you ask them in the moment, what are the tensions, what are the challenges? But it also makes it really difficult to answer questions like, does it work? How well does it work, right? Because it's this sort of shifting landscape. So we're in our mixed methods case study, we've done some interviews, we've been looking deeply at document review, we've done participant observation, and we're also paying a lot of attention, as you'll see in the presentation, to how data and findings are being presented to the public and to other stakeholders. So how is sort of the data and questions around micromobility being forefronted to encourage public debate or not? So a little bit of context for Denton County, or for Denton, Texas, right? As I said, it's at the northern edge of the, here's Dallas, and oh, Fort Worth doesn't even get a name on the map. This must have been made by someone in Dallas. Right, you can see here Denton County, right? It's one of the fastest growing counties in the nation, has been for the past couple years, right? Largely because of the explosion in DFW, and most of DFW's growth is happening on the northern sort of end of the metropolitan area. Here you can see Denton County's population, right? It was just around 400,000 in 2000, but will be north of 1.5 million within the next couple of years, or maybe even sort of more than that. Right. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say as well is some important things about Denton. Right? We have two fairly large colleges. We have the University of North Texas, which is where I teach, that has 43,000 students. We also have Texas Women's University, which has 11,000 students. Right? Some of the students live in town, but both colleges have very high commuter populations, largely serving the DFW region. Right? We also have two regional hospital campuses. So Denton's a town of about 140,000 people or so. We just approved housing for 60,000 more to come in over the next 5 or 6 years. So a lot of growth sort of coming down the way in Denton. We also have a transit authority and the third busiest commuter rail line in Texas, right? Big claim to fame, yes. So the Denton County Transportation Authority is the agency that we're going to be talking about a lot today. Right? It was formed in 2002, so it's about 20 years old. It's made up of 3 member cities, Denton, Louisville, and Highland Village. Louisville and Highland Village are just south of Denton, closer to Dallas, but still within Denton County. Right? Here you can see the sort of ridership on DCTA buses since 2007. Right? You can see that it's not necessarily growing, right? It's stagnant sort of over time a little bit. Some of the challenges that DCTA is currently facing, you can see here, are stagnant bus ridership. Right? Even though we have 2 growing student populations and we're in a growing region, we're not necessarily seeing that flush out in terms of travel behavior on the bus system. Right? There's a lot of claims and concerns that the fixed route is not cost effective. There's also a lot of concerns that the system doesn't serve users well. We run 40 to 60-minute headways on the buses. Right? It does connect to the commuter rail line, but not well. Right? There isn't sort of good timing and sort of those systems working together. And so it's not great from a user perspective. Right? One of the other things that I think is really important to think about is how Texas funds transit. And in particular, in the case of DCTA. Right? So DCTA is funded by a 0.05-cent sales tax that Denton, Louisville, and Highland Village all implement. Right? So that's a fee that went into effect in 2002, and the cities have been collecting that money, giving it to DCTA to both build the commuter rail line, which is 21 miles, and to operate the bus system. Right? Importantly, this sales tax allocation was done in 2002, only a couple years before the Texas state legislature allowed local governments to do sales tax for economic development purposes. So when Denton, Louisville, and Highland Village allocated their sales tax, there wasn't anything else that they could necessarily use those sales taxes for. But just a couple years later, Frisco, which is one of our sort of major municipal competitors, lobbied the state legislature to create a new funding mechanism. Ever since then, Denton and Louisville have been trying to get their sales tax back from DCTA, right? They would much rather use it for sort of local economic development. And as you can see here in 2021, they started a program with DCTA where they actually give back 15% of their operational revenue to the member cities if they want to use it for local place-based enhancements, right? The idea was that the cities could use it to build better bus stops or to build better sidewalks, to bus access, right? It's been used pretty aggressively by the city of Denton But we don't know exactly where those funds are going yet because it'll come out in next year's fiscal report, right? But you can see that there's sort of a strong financing angle to the story of DCTA. Right. Here is sort of what DCTA sets up as its own goals. So this is from a study that they commissioned a couple years ago on the benefits of transit in Denton County. So you can see that it's increasing the tax base, attracting new young professionals, right? Millennials, everyone's got a lot of hope on millennials to save us, right? Just like we do for almost every generation that's sort of coming down, right? The kids will get it. Also reducing the cost of living, right? And then supporting cleaner air, right? This is actually the smallest. It's kind of in the bottom of the report, so not emphasized as much as the other three, right? I want to talk just a little bit about DCTA's governance structure because it'll be helpful as we start walking through decision making. So it has 3 member cities that devote money to the system here, right? And it's got 5 voting board members made up of those 3 cities and some other representation. So there's 5 people who make decisions for the entire system, basically, right? This is different than just a couple years ago when they had 11 voting members. They've reduced the size of the board over time to sort of give more privilege to the member cities that pay in. Thinking about the kinds of services that DCTA operates or provides prior to their micromobility pilot, right? This is the DCTA system here. This is Denton. Up here, down here is Highland Village, and this is Louisville. This green line right here is the A train, which connects to DART, the Dallas Area Rapid Transit, so it's the 21-mile commuter line. DCTA operated 11 fixed route bus routes across Denton, Louisville, and Highland Village. As you can see, 40 to 60-minute headways. It also operates a university shuttle system, right, for UNT. And it also, in 2019, started 2 on-demand service zones, right, which you can see right here. So it started to pilot some Lyft pickup, so through a partnership with Lyft, and it also implemented a on-demand shuttle to an industrial park that wasn't being served well by its existing bus route. Right? So the agency started to dip its toes into this area of micromobility in 2019. And then in 2021, September, a year ago, it started this pilot. So GoZone is a proposed, or it was initially proposed to replace the entire bus system. So get rid of the 11 fixed routes and move to a purely on-demand model. Over the last year, they've readjusted this. Every 3 to 6 months, the bus routes are redone, replanned, sort of moved around, timing changes scheduled as a way to, as they're implementing GoZone. Right, you can see some of the claims around micromobility, right? Short wait times, service 365 days a year. There's a convenient mobile app that's not integrated with the existing transit app. So if you want to take a bus, you got one thing on your phone, switch over to GoZone, right? Hasn't necessarily, this is different than how DART has done it. DART has an integrated system, so one of the challenges with DCTA. So when we're thinking about sort of DCTA's experience with micromobility and microtransit, as I mentioned, there was 2 pilots that were done in 2019 that were pretty successful. A year later, they released their future roadmap document, which was supposed to be their strategic plan. They mentioned on-demand once at the very end in a list of other things we should sort of explore. But just 2 months later, they started conversations with VIA and GoZone to implement the on-demand mobility model, right? So I think one of the questions that we're still trying to pick out is how much of this is sort of an integrated strategy and how much of it is a shiny new thing that this is the moment, right? In particular, when we're thinking about these timelines, right? Right in here is when we're still dealing with COVID shutdowns and COVID rollbacks and people not necessarily using the system. So almost a window of opportunity from COVID to do something entirely different is sort of how the agency's proceeding. Right? In September 21, they started the GoZone service. And so we're going to talk a little bit about sort of what that experience has been like and how this relates to mobility justice. So here you can see the fixed route system. In green is the outline of the city of Denton, and in purple is the outline of the city of Louisville. So you can see that the fixed route bus did not serve the entire city, right? It served the areas where the colleges were. It served the downtown area in particular. And these are the proposed changes that went into effect or were proposed to go into effect a year ago, where we kept a couple of bus routes here in Denton, but we got rid of all the fixed routes in Louisville and Flower Mound and replaced them with, as you can see sort of outlined here, these GoZone service areas, these micromobility on-demand service areas. So when this plan is initially proposed, as I said, it starts in September 2021. The mayor of Denton, right, puts out a op-ed that says go zones of fulfillment of DCTA's mission. And we also see the development of Denton's first ever transit advocacy group called No Bus Cuts Denton, who you can see here. And these are sort of the major political responses to this proposal of the transit agency. I want to point out that former Mayor Watts, right, definitely emphasizes that the sales tax revenue that's going toward DCTA, he doesn't feel like is being used effectively, and that's one of the major reasons why they're sort of thinking differently about micromobility. Can this be a more cost-effective measure for providing transportation services? So when we're thinking about sort of coming back to our framework and thinking about Scheller's distributive justice, right, some of the questions that we have here for DCTA is how did DCTA compare fixed route to on-demand services? And how do they evaluate Title VI impacts of their on-demand services? There's FTA guidance on how to do this for fixed route. There isn't an established methodology or guidance on how to do it for on-demand in the same way. And so we're interested in what are sort of those innovations or assumptions that local agencies are making around this. So when we're calculating fixed route annual sort of person trips, right, this is a pretty standard methodology, as I said. Right? You do sort of a walking distance or an impact shed around different bus stops, right? You calculate how many people live around those bus stops, right? Here, a quarter mile, the number of times a bus serves the stop a year, right? So it's pretty traditional. Yeah?
When you're calculating annual person trips for a transit trip, are you saying a walk to a bus stop is one trip?
Yeah, getting on the bus is the trip, but that's a great question, right? Or a good thing to sort of point out. No, we're saying that it's simply the population near the bus stop within that sort of walk shed times the number of buses a year, right? And this here is a visual from the Title VI analysis that DCTA commissioned to try to figure this out. So when we looked at how this was being done for microtransit, we see that there's some sort of interesting mathematical assumptions going on, right? So we see that the number of people within the entire zone that's being served, right? So here you can see for the city of Denton, that is almost the entire Denton core, right? Times the annual operating hours of the vehicles, times the estimated vehicle trips per hour, right? And there was a real question of what are vehicle trips per hour when the service hasn't started yet? How do we sort of figure out what that number is? And in the case of DCTA, who hired VIA, right, it was the contractor that told them this is the right amount that needs to be done, right? Using sort of a remix model, which is a proprietary software that VIA has, they calculated that the appropriate number of service was 3.8, right? It's how many riders the contractor expects each vehicle to serve per hour, and that's what their model says is the appropriate service level. So applying these sort of frameworks to different benchmarks and thinking about demographics and thinking about sort of impacts and users, right, we can see here, and again from the analysis, right, the populations of concern should benefit proportionally to the overall population. But one of the things that we saw in the Title VI analysis was there was sort of this question of should we use statistics that are at the county level because it's a county-wide agency, or should we use statistics and numbers that represent the cities where the service actually happens, right? And the decision was made to use sort of the county metrics, which you can see here, right, are lower in terms of poverty level and in terms of minority population than the city. Not significantly, but differences there that become important once you start to sort of model out the impacts and ask questions about the equity, right? So this is, again, from the sort of equity analysis that was done. I think what's important here is you can see the estimated average passenger trips here, or annual passenger trips here, are from rider surveys. They're from experience, right? They're from data that we've accumulated over time, whereas the proposed services, which are, you know, almost more than double in magnitude in terms of projected ridership, are based on an algorithm and a number that VIA has sort of given as the appropriate level of service that should be used. Right? You can see here, right, some differences in terms of minority populations served, right, and populations of poverty served, but still within sort of that 5% threshold that is common to think about in terms of disparate impact, right? So from this, there was the conclusion that there is no disparate impact from switching to the on-demand model, that we would still be sort of within the right field of equity and fairness in thinking about making this policy move. Right? I'll go ahead and get past that. But one of the things that we saw when comparing sort of the fixed route analysis to the on-demand model was that there wasn't necessarily an apples to oranges comparison here. Right? That when we looked at revenue hours, right, for fixed route buses, it was all the service revenue hours. But for Go Zone, they would only count the revenue hours when there was a passenger actually in the vehicle. So deadheads going to pick people up or right after you drop people off, those didn't count as service hours in the same way that they would for a bus that didn't have anyone on it. Right? We also saw that the fares were different. Right? Half the cost for Go Zone, not necessarily figured into some of this modeling or thinking about equity and thinking about user use. Right? The service levels between fixed route buses and the Go Zone were changing. Right? Go Zone was going to be increasing, and the buses were seeing sort of a decline and a fluctuation in terms of the reliability as a system. Right? And we also, there's sort of different system integration. Right? There's daily and monthly passes that connect to the A train and that connect to DART, whereas Go Zone has a completely separate and fare system that doesn't allow people to necessarily buy a month pass for cheaper, right? So thinking about some of these other sort of equity implications from a user perspective and how they don't necessarily show up in the analysis that's done, right? So this is an assessment that 9 months into Go Zone, using sort of all of the math and metrics that we just laid out, in thinking about the productivity of the fixed routes that were still existing, versus the productivity of the Go Zone. If you remember, VIA's model of productivity says 3.8 is sort of that good number. So if you're above 3.8, then you're meeting your sort of minimum level of accessibility. And you can see some really big variability here in terms of the different bus routes, right? Some of them are performing really well. Some of them are not performing really well. By displaying the information this way, the conversations that have largely been going on with the board are about sort of what bus routes to cut or what bus routes to get rid of, whereas the conversations around Go Zone are really thinking a little bit more at the system-wide level. Right? So we have a bit of these apples to oranges sort of comparisons. So that's sort of how we're approaching distributive justice, this question of evaluating equity and disparate impact. When we move down to some of these next criteria related to deliberative or procedural justice, which, as I can remind you, is about governance processes, sort of recognizing specific groups' vulnerability, this is where we started to get into a little bit more, how was VIA and DCTA making the case about micromobility? What kind of data were they using to evaluate the project's success and to produce sort of political support for moving the project forward? And so one of the things that we saw in some of the documentation that they put together for the board to make the decision making, and this is from April 2021, so before this starts, is that they would be mapping out sort of net changes in person trips very separately from data on demographics, right? These are not displayed together. You can see some correlations between these, right? But not sort of packaged together for the board to consider in the same way. There's also a couple of things that were interesting about this, right? Particularly thinking about cartographic presentation and how powerful maps can be for helping people jump to conclusions that you'd like them to jump to. One of the things that we saw was sort of the use of the scale here, right? In doing these calculations, they used minority populations from Denton and Dallas County. The reason that they did that was because the city of Louisville has a little bit of its area that dips into Dallas County. And so they were able to justify using that data, which looks a lot different than Denton County. And you can see here that, you know, even though they have up to 54,000 people minority population per square mile, that number doesn't hold true at all in Denton. Right? So by setting up a scale that would make you say, well, this is only bad if it's really dark, but it's not as dark on the scale, right? It sort of is a little bit maybe misleading in how they're presenting the data, right? So going back to thinking about that Title VI analysis and the amount of discretion that's left to local actors, here's a perfect example of how that discretion can potentially be misleading or lead people to conclusions that they want them to see, right? One of the analysis that Keenan did with some of the GIS was thinking about what if we combine these two maps? And what if it was presented this way to the board in terms of its decision making? And then it becomes a lot more clear in where sort of the net change in minority population annual person trips might be. So could this type of cartographic presentation spur a bit of a different conversation around impacts and around equity, right? And helping agencies sort of think about that. There's also this question of sort of contextualizing the data, right? These projections versus reality. There was questionable starting data in terms of bringing in data from Dallas County, in terms of assumptions about levels of service that were gotten from VIA's proprietary algorithm, right? And are also thinking about sort of the growing pains, right? These are maps that were proposed before the service started, but there hasn't been sort of that same back analysis over the past year to see if these maps hold true in that same way. So a couple of other things, just sort of thinking about governance and decision making and sort of how this has been playing out. So here you can see, right, initially DCTA's media coverage was not great around GoZone. There was a lot of questions from local city council and from local news outlets about how effective this was. No Bus Cuts Denton, as I mentioned, was a new advocacy group that was formed. Importantly, their main focus was about protecting the jobs of the bus drivers. They did not have a focus on sort of user impacts within their advocacy efforts, which is one of the reasons why they haven't been that effective at sort of being included in the decision making. Right? But you can see here that they had a whole workers plan for public transportation, right? Coming at this with a different perspective, but that hasn't been even in conversation with DCTA. It's a very adversarial relationship as it currently stands. The other thing I think that's important in thinking about sort of governance and advocacy was that they couldn't find advocate partners. So No Bus Cuts Denton went to DART and into Dallas and tried to work with some of the transit advocacy groups there, but they were very clear that DCTA is not necessarily our problem, that we can't work together with you on that. So the lack of an advocacy organization previously, I think, hinders part of this governance process. But the agency did make an effort to reach out to different groups, right? Rather than sort of going to direct community engagement, largely because they were claiming they were still sort of under COVID. It was hard to get access to people. It was hard to engage with people. One of the things that the agency does do, and has done even before this pilot, was have monthly meetings with social service agencies to figure out how their clients are responding to just general DCTA services, including GoZone. In March 2022, so this is maybe 6 months after the pilot starts, they had a bit of a mutiny on their hands from the social service agencies. GoZone was not working well. It had been working well for the first couple of months for some of the agency clients, but as it had gone on, it had proven to be really kind of disastrous. And the bus cuts had meant that people weren't able to get to the food banks, weren't able to get to the clinics. Right? So DCTA responded to some of this concern by adding in some new bus routes, right? And sort of thinking differently about what they were going to cut. Could this have been something that might have been done proactively? Yes, right? When we're thinking about sort of equity and governance, maybe these are conversations you should have had before the pilot instead of halfway through the pilot, right? One of the things that's hard to pull out is the impact on individuals and what kind of chaos this produces for people who rely on transportation. Right. Another thing that happens in March 2022 is this 6 months into the pilot, they realized that the majority of people using the system are UNT students, and that the majority of people using the GoZone live right within the heavy area of where the bus systems are. Right? So they decide to start to discourage UNT students from using GoZone, right, as a way to sort of free up capacity for other people. So trying to encourage different mode shifts. Right? And here you can see these are from the apps on my phone, right? Oh no, are you having trouble getting a GoZone? Well, you can work with sort of these other services that we provide. Again, thinking about timing on this. Maybe when you rolled out the GoZone system, having these systems integrated would have been more effective than 6 months into the system, now telling people that it's not going to work for you or we don't want you to use it, right? And there was a lot of conversations in the sort of the board conversation as well about this is not for UNT students. Right? That UNT students are not the populations we're trying to serve. We're trying to serve non-students. Right? It's a really interesting sort of framework for moving through that. Right. Here you can see just some more sort of time frame stuff. So September 2021 when it starts, right? Not looking great compared to buses, right? 6 months later, if you want to improve the GoZone, then they need more money, right? DCTA approves, even more money than the contractor asked for, and so we're seeing more and more funds go into this micromobility system to try to get to the level of service that was supposed to be under sort of the initial contract, right? And then as of recently, right, they're cutting bus routes, and settling on more go zone pricing. So putting a lot more public money into one type of transportation versus another without sort of proven data that it's working effectively. Public feedback has not been great around go zone, right? There's been a lot of pushback and concern about how well the system is working. This is, here you can see overall negative. The agency interprets neutral as good. So often when the board's talking about it, they'll say, well, 60% of people don't hate it. So it works out okay, right? So there's really sort of this defining your metrics of success in ways that allow you to continue pursuing the technology solution that you want to pursue, right? So again, a lot of discretion locally for thinking about this, right? We still have sort of advocacy groups. This is No Bus Cuts Denton, right, doing a thing at the county courthouse this summer, and they've also put up signs to try to organize more people around Denton to be concerned about bus route cuts. But again, still not really an effective advocacy effort in terms of getting involved with those deliberations and procedural process discussions, right? So how are we, right? We're 1 year into Go Zone, right? How is it working? Well, there's a couple of issues that continually start to come up, right? One of the things is that a lot of your requests for Go Zone, right? So like when you request an Uber or Lyft and it'll tell you it's coming in 5 or 10 minutes, right? We've seen major issues with dropped calls for Go Zone, right? Here you can see this is the amount of ride requests that are turned away by Go Zone. This does not count people that see the time frame and say, I'm not doing that. This counts people that see that's going to be 20 minutes or 30 minutes and still say, I'm going to wait, but then they get, it's going to be an hour. It's going to be an hour and a half, and so they drop out. So we actually think that this is pretty much underestimating the amount of ride requests that are getting turned away. Right? And just to think a little bit about this, so if we had buses that were overly full with people so that they couldn't get on them, right? What would the politics sort of be there? Right? It would be that maybe we should put more buses on. Maybe we should sort of think about different modes, right? And that's sort of the response here. But the response is largely we need to give VIA more money so that they can provide better VIA service, right? Or better sort of on-demand service, right? And when we look at Go Zone ridership, we do see that it's been going up over time, right? Even as the system's been a little haphazard, even as sort of the public response to it hasn't been great, we are seeing that increase in ridership that we haven't been seeing with the buses over time, right? So this is a real focus for the board, that this is on a growth trajectory, right? But here you can see these are the estimated wait times, right? So the buses run on a 40 to 60 minute headway, and typical wait times for Go Zone are still under that, right? But again, not necessarily thinking about people who are dropping out or not having your ride show up, which happens a lot as well. Right? So what has been the agency's response to this, right? Well, as I mentioned earlier, right, here you can see for fiscal year 23, they've approved more money for Go Zone, right? That because it's sort of on a growth trajectory, we should take more money, we should take money away from the buses, and they're cutting bus routes, to put it more toward micromobility because it seems to be sort of working better in terms of ridership numbers and in terms of expanding coverage, even if from a user perspective, there isn't sort of clear data that it's working out all that well. And starting in January, we will have another revision to the system, right? As part of this having to pay via more or devoting more money to micromobility, they're increasing the fare for Go Zone from 75 cents to up to $5 because they're adding in some sort of distance-based components, right? They're also cutting, as you can see, some of the bus lines. Right? But on a positive, they're extending service on some of the bus lines and increasing weekday frequency. So one of the positive outcomes of the micromobility has been that the board has had to look in more detail at what bus routes are working. Which fixed route makes sense, and how can we tweak them more? Rather than just saying this route doesn't work, we're going to toss it out. So it has sort of started more conversation around these trade-off questions. So when we're thinking about sort of mobility justice, just to sort of wrap up on this, right? When we think about distributive justice, right? VIA is setting minimum accessibility levels, right? That is one of the suggestions in the literature, that we should have minimum accessibility levels. But we don't have minimum accessibility levels for our fixed route buses. And so then it becomes sort of different standards for different types of modes that are supposed to function as a complementary system, right? We also know that this 3.8 vehicle trips per mile comes from a proprietary sort of black box algorithm that VIA uses. So it's very hard to sort of have a conversation about whether that number is right, because there's this, well, that's what it says. That's what the math says is. That's what we have to do. That's what our expertise of the private contractor shaping how the private contractor sort of does its job and what it budgets looks like, right? There's also a big imbalance in projected demand and the on-demand service levels. So one of the differences with VIA and with GoZone is that you just have to have a driver's license to drive them. They're minivans. They're not commercial driver's license, right? And so it's a different pool of workers. They've had a very hard time getting people to drive for GoZone because they don't pay that well, and people don't necessarily want to be in sort of these arrangements, right? When we think about the deliberative or procedural, sort of the bigger governance questions, right, we know that the distributive benchmarks are not being set by the deliberative process, right? It's not a conversation among the board and among users about what's the right level of accessibility. It's very much sort of this model saying this is the appropriate level of accessibility for your current land use density and your current population, right? So kind of not having the move to sort of debate that, right? As we went over earlier, there's also some questionable presentation of data and cartographic sort of assumptions about how things are being presented. Because this information isn't necessarily public, so VIA just started making available a public dashboard with the data, but for the first 9 months didn't. There wasn't a great way for advocates and other folks to have a conversation with the agency or with the provider about sort of what was going on. So this access to data when we're thinking about contracted out work, particularly around micromobility, is a really sort of important aspect, I think, for thinking about procedural justice, right? Another thing that sort of comes up under procedural justice is thinking about the goals, right? Expansion of coverage. Can we serve a larger geographic area? Has been sort of a set goal that can't be touched under this framework of decision making, right? Rather than thinking more about higher frequency and serving people who are in areas where fixed route transit or transit traditionally has worked, there's really been this focus on expanding coverage sort of out to a broader area, even if that doesn't necessarily come with more users in that outside area, because we still see most of the users from the central area, right? As I mentioned, limited data access with the public, the city councils, and the advocates has made it difficult to have a real community conversation about the value of micromobility and about how it's working for Denton. And we also see that it's been a very sort of reactive approach to what's going on, right? Rather than sort of thinking about what would the micromobility strategy be and evaluating that holistically before we jumped into doing it, we very much jumped into doing it, and now we're sort of backpedaling and maneuvering within that space, right? So thinking more about sort of the epistemic or sort of the learning activities that are going on here, right? Is DCTA sort of open to new knowledge, ways of knowing and learning? And I think we can say that over the last year, it has been positive to see the board conversations change, right? Topics that were not coming up a year ago are now coming up more, related to equity, related to service, related to access to fares and payment sources. So we've seen some real evolution in sort of the quality of conversation that goes on with the board. Right? We also see that DCTA is making incremental adjustments to services, right? As you saw in sort of that app earlier, they're actually letting GoZone users now know that there is a bus and there is a train, and maybe you should take those, right? So moving toward thinking about this more from a sort of a network perspective. But what we definitely do see is this optimism bias for new technology solutions, right? So this idea that fixed route buses have been around for 15 years, they haven't been increasing in their sort of people using them, but new technology will sort of solve that problem, right? For a variety of reasons. And so we're thinking about this in terms of this maladaptive planning, right? Are there processes at work that are promoting only certain alternatives, only certain solutions that can be considered, right? And with DCTA, there's never really been a conversation of should we just go back and build more bus routes? Or I should say that conversation is just starting to evolve, right? It's always been about how can we make micromobility work for us? Not does micromobility work for us, but how can we make it work for us as sort of a predetermined solution? So we're still sort of figuring out, right, can micromobility be one of the things that's sort of helping reorient us toward justice, changing the system, right? I'm an optimist. I think there's room for it. I think we shouldn't necessarily discount technology solutions, but I'll also say that looking at the case in Denton makes me a little skeptical about our ability to implement this in a fair and equitable way because of how we're sort of approaching the problem, I think. We're also sort of thinking about this implementation, right, and how messy, complex, and nonlinear it is. Right? Often when we look at things historically, there's sort of a clear rational argument about how things happened. But when you're in the thick of that, it's not rational at all, or sort of clear. And I think for those of you who are thinking about going into planning or working for transit agencies, this is important to recognize that there's sort of a lot of value-based decision-making that goes on, but also there's a lot of discretion to do good in that messy, complex sort of scenario, right? All right, and so that is all I have on the DCTA case. Thank you for your attention, and I hope we can have some conversations about what we learn here, where we go from here, and is micromobility a solution?